or looper. You have to know how to use them properly. But they do have some control for looper. For fungus gnat, use hypoaspis. For russet mite, burn your crop. For mealybug, burn your crop. No, but in all seriousness, I don't think Health Canada would like it if you burn your crop. So instead, just call it.
No burning crops, just burning buds. Okay, let's stop talking about the bugs. Let's spend some time talking about plant viruses.
Ooh, plant virus and plant disease. Okay, so there's all different kinds of fungi out there in the world. And if you've worked in a greenhouse, especially if you've worked with coir or cocoa growing media, you'll know that a lot of spores in the air land where they will, and when the conditions are right, they will grow, meaning they need the right temperature and the right moisture, and a beautiful fungus will grow. It can be any color. Most of them are quite inert, not threatened to the plants at all. And when one of the parameters is removed, that fungus dies. So in my last, say, 20 years, I've seen so many beautiful different kinds of fungi, and they're nothing to be scared of. That said, there are a few species of fungi that do affect our agricultural crops around the world. So that includes cannabis. It's no different, and we'll talk about that.
Okay, so let's talk about the main fungal infections that all LPs experience. Powdery mildew, botrytis, fusarium.
Okay, I think that powdery mildew is probably the main one, and I like to describe something called the silent debate. Among the science professionals, there is a very small debate whether or not powdery mildew is systemic or not. But for this argument's sake, we'll just say that it is. So the number one thing you should do is keep your plants healthy. You know all the ways to do this. This is not what this podcast is about, but give it proper nutrition, good drainage, good airflow, good growing media, proper waterings, and proper temperatures. Let's talk about the temperatures though. Watch your graphs. If you don't have a graph to watch, then just pay attention to the temperatures, because you can definitely cool off quickly, but you shouldn't warm up quickly. And if you have spikes and valleys within your relative humidities and your temperatures, those are indications and precursors to potential powdery mildew coming out of the plant. Density and darkness are not your friend. And there's also the strain game, which means different strains are more susceptible. Different strains require different growing conditions. And if you don't have that dialed in, and the plant does have powdery mildew systemically in it, through its plant stresses, it could come out, and then it could sporulate, and then you could have more powdery mildew. So the best action is definitely going to be prevention. But I think that we'll talk about the things that you can do if you get powdery mildew, or ways to prevent it when we talk about the pesticides later in this podcast. And we'll just continue on with the other fungi like botrytis and fusarium. So botrytis is the fungus that grows on everything. It's everywhere. The spores are everywhere in the air. For example, when you're going grocery shopping and you're looking at that tray of strawberries and you look at the bottom of the clamshell to see if there are any rotten ones, sometimes you'll see some gray fuzzy mold growing on there. That's botrytis. Sometimes it catches you by surprise where you put a strawberry in your mouth and then it doesn't taste good and you spit it out. That's botrytis. Or sometimes you put the bad strawberry in your mouth and you choke it down because you are where you are and you're being polite. That's botrytis. So botrytis can happen to any plant, really on any plant part. The main place for cannabis would be the stem and or the flower, the bud. And it can be like a gray color or a brown or a browny gray or even a white. So don't judge by the color, but that's generally the look and the location. You can have a dry starting out botrytis, then it can go to a fuzzy or a wet. regardless, it's really common and it's nothing to be getting too upset about. In fact, they even made a kid movie about botrytis. It's called Epic. And actually, there's 2 kid movies about it because Moana also touches on botrytis. When the black starts eating into her island, turning everything from green to black, that's botrytis. So the thing about botrytis is it requires a wound or a dead plant cell to start. But once it starts, it can then continue to consume the plant until it's dead. Again, you have to do many preventative measures to prevent this from happening. So the best thing you can do is reduce all of your botrytis spores in the air in your space. So if you have a home grow, when you have no plants in there, you want to do a really good cleanup job. And if you're an LP, you want to make sure your room resets are really effective. And then after that, you have to sanitize between cuts and keep your sanitation methods in line because, again, botrytis starts and continues with plant wounds. And we'll touch about the other things that you can do using pesticides later on.
Yes, I have certainly learned that sanitation can go a long way. Now, how about Fusarium?
Okay, so Fusarium is a harder one to get rid of. You don't want to let it go too far. The longer you let it go, the harder it will be to rid of. But it also includes, a good sanitation program. You want to do all you can when you don't have plants in there, but it also includes making sure that your feed water is clean. It's one pathogen that spreads very quickly, and again, sanitation of your blades, your cutting blades, whatever you're using to cut or prune your plants or take your clones, that's all really important. You'll often see it at the clone stage. It'll be often a very dense, not very fuzzy, but a very dense white. If you're unsure if you have Fusarium or not, I would definitely recommend sending a test away to make sure of the identification of that fungus.
Okay, so how do you tell the difference between a plant virus and a disease?
That's a good one. So the symptoms for the diseases, the most common diseases, which we just covered with, powdery mildew and botrytis and Fusarium, are very different symptoms than most plant viruses. Plant viruses, for example, tomato mosaic virus is a very popular one, and it has the mottled variation of the color in the leaves, but it has a very distinct look to it. So a lot of people will see plant variegation in the leaves and right away assume it's something like TMV or tobacco mosaic virus, but it isn't. Plants are allowed to have distinguished features based on their genetics, and that's okay. There are known viruses in cannabis that affect the cannabis plant species, including cannabis cryptic virus, which Matthew Gates has recently drawn a lot of attention to. So I thank him for that. There's also hop latent viroid, which isn't a virus, it's a viroid. There's a difference. But there's also a lot of leaf spots and some rust. So that's where you really have to know the difference between nutritional deficiencies and knowing the symptoms of those compared to virus symptoms. And as more research comes on, really cannabis-specific research, we're going to be able to identify those right away, and we'll know the ones that are a threat and you should, basically cull your crop, or the ones where a healthy plant can grow through it and you shouldn't have a problem and no reason to hit the panic button there.
So we've talked about a lot of pathogens. Should we be worried?
No, I don't think so. For example, that's why we irradiate things. We irradiate all different kinds of foods. That just kills all the pathogens, including like bacteria and anything that, might be there. For the same reason, we irradiate things like, for example, if you're getting a knee replacement and it goes through irradiation so that any kind of pathogen that could be living in that plastic material that they're going to put in your body is first sterilized through and through, and then they put it in your body. So it's not going to cause any problems.
Thanks, Laura. So this podcast is about ICM. So now let's talk about pesticides.
Pesticides. In the vegetable industry, we are allowed to use what I would call real pesticides, real chemicals that have been through rigorous testing. And once they've been used, they basically become inert, kind of like bleach. Once bleach is dry, it's not going to do anything. And we don't have that tool in our toolbox for indoor or greenhouse cannabis at all.
So how does that make any sense? We can use chemicals on food, but we can't use chemicals on cannabis.
Yeah, I know. I've thought about that a lot. Like, here we are spraying these heavy-duty, real, pesticides on our bell peppers, and then we hand it to our 2-year-olds because it's nutritious. But how dare you spray something on that precious, cannabis flower? But I think the difference is that the cannabis flower is unique in that it's lit on fire. That said, I often wonder about the concept of putting, a bell pepper on a barbecue. Is that lighting it on fire?
Well, before I put my bell pepper on the barbecue, though, I wash it. I make sure it's washed thoroughly to wash any residual pesticides off.
Well, that's awesome that you wash the outside, and as we should, but a lot of chemicals these days, chemical pesticides anyway, on our food aren't on the surface, they're on the inside of the food because we give the pesticides to the plant roots. They take it up systemically, and it's all in all parts of the plant. Unless we're talking about things like citrus with lemon or lime or orange, they have the skin on the outside, which is not eaten normally. So a lot of pesticides are on the outside of those fruits. And so that's why often you'll see some people won't put the slice of lemon or lime into their drink, because essentially what you're doing is putting the dried pesticides on the outside of that rind into your water or into your drink, and then sort of rehydrating it, which probably isn't the greatest. Or in the case of diatomaceous earth, for example, a lot of the organic growers don't have a lot of tools or a lot of options because, of course, they don't use pesticides. So instead they use diatomaceous earth. And we call it diamond dust because it never breaks down. So the person thinks, oh, my stuff is organic, I don't have to wash it. It's probably fine, and then they consume it. But there's some diatomaceous earth on there, and it gets into your bloodstream or the smallest part of your lungs, and it stays there for life, just scratching away. And, you never had a cigarette in your life, but now you've got lung cancer and you don't know why. It could be diatomaceous earth.
So you mean that the government allows chemical pesticides to be sprayed on foods, but does not allow it to be sprayed on cannabis?
Yes, that's right. Exactly. We can use true pesticides on our vegetables, but we use biopesticides basically only in our cannabis. So let's be clear about what those are.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion and misinformation in the public about licensed producers and pesticide use. I had an experience a few months ago where I was renewing my medical cannabis prescription, and the lady speaking to the cannabis consultant right next to me, when asked some questions about her preferred licensed producer, said that she would prefer the producer that used no pesticides. And I thought to myself, well, none of us can use real pesticides. And then it occurred to me that how on earth would the public know that? The cannabis consultant did not know that. And how would anybody else? So I think it's important to talk about the active ingredients available in the pesticides that Health Canada has approved for cannabis use.
Yeah, so if people would like to see what Health Canada does allow for pesticides, they just have to go to the website and under the label search, type in cannabis. And right now there are 28 registered pesticides allowed for cannabis. But for example, the active ingredients include